Darwin Core was developed between 1999 and 2009 by a working group of biodiversity professionals, now called the Biodiversity Information Standards. Based on Darwin Core and developed with an open source framework in mind so that community members could use and contribute to the standards, the goals of the original working group were to develop a standard way to record and share data about both institutional collection specimens, as well as develop a way for live biodiversity data to be shared easily and effectively. In addition, the group created a recommendation standard for common vocabulary and schema for encouraging interoperability and cooperation amongst all stakeholders. Darwin Core's basic structure is modeled on Darwin Core, but specifically deals with biodiversity and principles related to taxonomy, or the ordering of organisms, like Charles Darwin's Origin of Species laid out based on shared characteristics in the natural world. Darwin Core's very basic structure, which doesn't set out specific requirements for what items one needs to record beyond a very few items, such as limiting the use of a term to one instance or using controlled vocabulary where appropriate, very much mimics that of Darwin Core. So in other words, you can't use one of the terms more than once, which is very different from Darwin Core. Keeping the structure open has allowed for flexibility in who can use it, how it can be used, and allows it to be used for emerging fields in recording or developing their own specific needs. For example, scientists working in genome tracing or genetic engineering have used this standard as the basis for expanding to use for their own research. Darwin Core's overarching structure is similar to Darwin Core in that it uses one-to-one element value sets, or in Darwin Core, term value element sets, to describe a specimen or occurrence of a specimen in nature. Darwin Core terms are organized for easier use under classes, which are not recorded as elements, but help in identifying which set of terms may be useful to someone creating a record. These broad classes help to organize over 150 standardized terms, so that if someone doesn't need to include observation data, for example, they can skip over that class of terms. Here's an example of the terms for the class occurrence. Notice how those items relate to what seems like would be a description of a live specimen, including behavior and disposition. Occurrence is used to record encounters with nature or a specimen, not a natural history specimen like a taxidermy specimen, for example. Someone recording data in this instance would only use those items that make sense to use under the occurrence section, along with any other terms from any other classes that would be appropriate. While it is suggested in the simple Darwin Core guide that any applicable data be recorded, it's not prescribed that all data needs to be used in each class. Here are some examples of other classes within Darwin Core, which have nested terms under them to use in the creation of a record. Note how organism has very few items nested under it, but geological context has many more options for description. Overall, the 150 plus terms are nested under 12 individual class designations, including one called record level, which is specifically used for elements taken from Darwin Core or modified from other standards. Terms such as type, language, and references are inherited from Darwin Core, while other terms such as collection code, basis of record, and others were specifically developed for those that need to record administrative or format data in a way that is specific to biodiversity items and data sets. There are a few things that are very unique about Darwin Core, including that it is used to describe living organisms and collections, something that is unlike many of the other standards we've come across so far. While there are parallels in this sense with Darwin Core and schema.org, for example, which are technically able to handle descriptions of live organisms, using things like the person element in schema.org, for instance, where you could describe a live person. This standard was specifically designed around the challenges of describing a vast array of possible objects in the natural world. It was created to solve a problem in natural history collections, to make data more easily shareable, but was soon adapted to record all types of data, including live observation and specimen data. In other words, an amateur naturalist observing ant behavior could use this standard to share data on observations, just as a government conservation organization could use it to track invasive species or populations of endangered wildlife or plants. Its flexibility, therefore, allows it to be used by trained professionals or an amateur naturalist organization, thereby making all kinds of data available for studying biodiversity in global contexts. Darwin Core is just super cool. From my own observations, one challenge I noticed might be that Darwin Core requires a certain amount of background knowledge about taxonomy and biodiversity. I can't imagine anyone that doesn't have any background in biology or basic ecology would be able to use this easily. There are also potential issues with Darwin Core, as with any standard, which TWDG acknowledges on their simple Darwin Core guide. These include that terms can only be used once per record, and that because of the simple structure in differing communities using the standards, the perception that data sets could be dirtied by bad data could be prevalent. TDWG defends the use of simple Darwin Core by explaining how its flexibility is actually a promoter of sharing, evaluating, and encouraging the interoperability of data and collaboration among different communities. A virtue of Darwin Core's flexible structure is that it makes the adaptability of data sets more realistic. For example, here is a Darwin Core record in XML. This same data can also be expressed in other ways, including in a CSV or text file for using in databases or textual descriptions of specimen collections, as well as in RDF triples. Several biodiversity organizations have created tools for users to implement Darwin Core into their collections records or record observational data in the field by use of checklists and guides for identification. Several collaboratives, such as VertNet, the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, and the Atlas of Living Australia, make data sets and identification databases available for general use through Darwin Core standards. Hopefully now that you've learned more about Darwin Core, you're interested in digging into this standard a little bit more. If you're interested, I've listed some of the resources that I checked out here, and I also have linked below to the annotated resource guide that I created for this project. Thank you for learning more with me about Darwin Core.